it might be great to start with just discussing people's sense of those options. I mean, I heard you discuss that a bit in the previous session, Mike. You brought that up, and a few people gave some ideas about that. I think this is also a way of us surfacing the question of the relevance of, broadly speaking, metaphysics to science, and also the relevance if we're going to invoke the name of Plato, if we're going to invoke, metaphysical themes, what is the relevance of the history of philosophy to a consideration of those things, since a lot of these concepts have been around for a very long time. And so a lot of the possible alternatives, obviously not all of them, are actually present in the history of philosophy. And so referring to some of those models can be a way of, at the very least, clarifying our thinking about what we're trying to achieve by either extending upon or returning to some prior conception. So, I mean, really briefly, without articulating in detail what each of them is, I would say, four options I could think of would be, so-called physicalism, or the mechanical philosophy, sometimes referred to. A form of Platonism, maybe a classical Platonism, or just a Platonism which presumes the existence of these two worlds, one with the forms and one the actual world. Of course, they're eliding the nuance in Plato's own thinking for the minute. A neo-Darwinian conception, which may have things in common with both physicalism, the mechanical philosophy, and Platonism. And then what I would think of as a properly Darwinian perspective, in which the role of the forms is quite different in the sense that it's a way, a mode of reasoning which tries to account for the genesis of forms without presupposing their a priori definiteness or their a priori existence. And so I think what we would want to discuss then, and in terms of something like a diagrammatic schema or a series of schemas, is how, for example, not exclusively, but form itself operates in each of those different schemes. And that might help get us clear about what's at stake when we say we're moving beyond physicalism, or we are invoking Platonism in a certain way, or we are or are not being Darwinian, or Darwinism is or is not sufficient to account for the kinds of questions that Mike's asking in his research, and that I think probably a lot of us are asking in different domains. Certainly I've been asking in terms of origins of novel functions at the molecular level. So yeah, that's one thing I put out there.
What do you mean by Darwinian? Do you mean that whatever forms there are totally as a result of chance in history, that different organisms living in different environments could have come up with a very different mathematics?
Yeah, big question, and something that I've spent a lot of time trying to articulate in the last few years. Like, what is the difference between what I'm thinking of as sort of Darwinian and, say, neo-Darwinism, for example? But really briefly and schematically, I would say this Darwinian mode of reasoning is one that puts a process of variation prior to the existence of, you could say, the forms, if you want. So it is a mode of reasoning which takes variation, or Darwin would say the overproduction of variation, as the primary given, and then invokes a principle of selection in order to try and account for why that variation is clearly not continuous, right? Why there are clumps in the distribution of that variation, and those clumps roughly correspond then to, species or to forms. Now, when you open that up to a kind of a metaphysical program, and when you ask a question like, would they have different mathematics, you're already kind of moving, we're moving well beyond Darwin's own conception. Darwin's desiderata are relatively humble in comparison. He's willing to take sort of Newtonian physics for granted and things like that. He's not trying to explain life, the universe, and everything. But when you do, as various, say, process relational philosophers have attempted to do in different ways, when you try to generalize that Darwinian mode of reasoning, you do end up coming up with some, very different perspectives. And so you certainly could think of different mathematics or different logics emerging from this kind of variation and selection and inheritance scheme, absolutely. And this would not preclude, of course, the fact that all organisms everywhere may be, similarly, quote unquote, adapted to, say, physical constraints that are exceptionally ancient, that might be, more than 13 billion years old. So they form part of the environmental background that all living systems would necessarily be, again, quote unquote, adapted to. But we might even want to ask questions in, say, fundamental physics, as many people do these days. What are the origins of those constraints? Why these laws? Why these constants of nature, etc.? And people are turning to what, again, I would call sort of slightly Darwinian, or people might say as a SAC term, evolutionary modes of reason to try and ask those sorts of questions as well. So in general, it's just the attempt to minimize the a priori content of our approach, try to get behind the defined forms, and see if they have themselves a process of genesis that might account for them. That's what I would think of as the Darwinian attempt.
So, if I understand you correctly, it seems like there's different levels of this Darwinism you're talking about. We could, let's just take the physical world as fixed, right?
Mhm.
Then within those parameters of, say, medium, the size of objects that the organisms that we know, cells and things like that, work with, we could talk about some parameters of the physical world that actually control what their perceptual systems are, how they, that a cell has to know where it is in space and time, let's say,
Sure.
right? Just
Mhm.
just basic. Even if in some quantum physics sense those are illusions, right? But if we just start there is that kind of a base. But what you're suggesting, it seems to me, I heard you saying that deeper than the level of physics that we just find ourselves dealing with on the planet Earth, it's possible that the laws of physics themselves are susceptible to some kind of Darwinian evolution or natural selection. That's what it seems like you're suggesting, that they're not themselves fixed. And some cosmologists have said things like this. I just want to see if that's what you're suggesting.
I would say that kind of approach would be the consequence of a speculative generalization of Darwinian modes of reasoning. Yes. So how successful that's going to be, that's a completely different question. I'm saying this is a method in some sense, right? But it does come along with an attempt to, or in a sense, the necessity of reevaluating the role that, say, invariants, things that are taken to be fixed, play in our explanatory schemas.
Yeah.
Um,
If I if I if I may just offer a potentially helpful simplification, I like your four-part typology, Tim, of the mechanical philosophy, Platonism, neo-Darwinism, and then proper Darwinism in your sense. But it could just be that we have really two options here, Platonism and Darwinism, a kind of speculative Darwinism, like you're suggesting, because the mechanical philosophy, um, rooted in a Newtonian mathematical physics, is in a sense a degraded Platonism, as is
yeah.
neo-Darwinism with its emphasis on information being carried by a genome. These are both, I would say, degraded forms of Platonism, or at least really inheriting the Platonic mode of thought in a sense, whereas Darwin is the real alternative, even though, as you acknowledge, the final paragraph of Origin refers to the fixed law of gravity. He wasn't yet thinking cosmologically about evolution, but there's a lot of reason to maybe want to do that. And so we have the Darwinian and the Platonist versions of the two options here, where Darwin would say that all form is a function of chance variation selected and sort of historically accumulated, whereas Plato would say, nope, the forms are there already, and whatever evolution might be is a selection among pre-existing forms. Those seem to me to be the two options on the table here. I don't know if that's an oversimplification, but
Well, it
No,
seems to me that you're leaving out the Kantian option.
that science is limited to a phenomenal realm, and that we're
Well,
not actually.
yeah, science is constructed by the mind, right?
Mhm.
That that yeah, I mean, space, time, all the categories we use for perceiving, making judgments in the world, these are all
Sure.
constructed by the mind, and that's
And the
you know.
mind being ahistorical and not.
Well, yeah, I mean, now obviously there's Darwinian spins on that, but I think Kant was talking about pure phenomenology, right? That it is, this sort of logic of what an experience must be like, right? That it must be like a certain way, or it's not
Yeah.
any experience at all. Yeah. So it is from the perspective of this Kantian. You have to go deep into understand what it is, but it is what for the possibility of any experience, right? That's what
Yeah.
Kant's talking about. And
You're right to bring up Kant, and I think there are various examples of philosophers who want to overcome this dichotomy. I mean, Kant's pre-Darwinian, but um, my own personal approach would be we don't need to choose one or the other. We need some kind of a synthesis here, but um, Kant would be an example of that. But we need to, I think, Kant's understanding of the mind with the categories just sort of appearing from nowhere. Like we needed a genetic account of that, or a evolutionary account of where the human mind comes from, obviously, right?
no, I think you're right. I mean, it's like a miracle. It's like, did God make it, or why does it work, right? We need some account of that. You're right.
So in terms of the dichotomy that Matt was giving, I mean, Kant is pretty quote unquote Platonic in this sense, but the a priori forms are transcendental instead of transcendent. And so that's how Schelling reads Plato, in fact, as a kind of proto-transcendentalist. I mean, these things obviously get complicated and nuanced depending on how deep in the weeds we want to go. But I do like, and Matt very much knows that I like that dichotomy, because I think the radical nature of the quote unquote Darwinian intervention, and I'm not saying that he was the first to say these kinds of things. I mean, you can even think of it as a pre-Socratic way of thinking, but it's the radicalness of that is typically underestimated, and the kind of neo-Darwinian attempt to integrate it into the physicalist or mechanical philosophy, to identify a privileged sort of basis of causal reduction in the gene, etc., actually moves us back into that Platonic conception in a really important way as well. So I do think, again, incredibly schematically, that dichotomy is pretty useful for us, because it's all about, what's the a priori, like to what extent are we relying on something that doesn't have its own genesis. And I mean, you can always say that variation in the Darwinian thing is the thing that doesn't have its own account, right? It's just the thing that's taken a priori as given. But I would want to also signal that there's a way in which this Darwinist view is also related to a kind of Platonism, in the very weak sense that it acknowledges the reality of possibility or potential. So it's not deterministic in the way that the mechanical philosophy becomes, when the mechanical philosophy collapses the forms into the actual. Whereas in the Darwinian account, there's a very open-ended, and real sense of possibility. It's just about how is that possibility structured? How does it become what Mike would refer to as a latent space, rather than proposing or postulating that it's always already a latent space with forms inhabiting it. It needs to have its own, like as Peirce would say, Charles Sanders Peirce would say, in his attempt to generalize Darwin into a metaphysical way of thinking. The account of the evolution of the universe has to also be an account of the becoming and the evolution of the forms, not taking them as a priori. But I don't want to like turn the whole conversation into this. I just thought that was a useful schema for us to begin with. I'm sure a lot of other people have stuff to say, so I'm going to try and shut up.
I
Mary,
mean, no,
yeah.
sorry. I mean, this was wonderful. It was a wonderful kickstart also. And if I agree that calling it, or at least putting it in these terms, even if loosely, it is helpful. And perhaps there is this even a deeper dichotomy inside what it means to be Darwinian, I would say, because on the origin of species, he lingers a lot about the question of polymorphism as this variation. There are, I guess, paraphrasing, fluctuating elements, specifically in polymorphic species, where Mike also raised the question of the embodiment or disembodiment of memories. And I think this dichotomy then it seems to also extend to Brouwer and his lectures on mathematics, and philosophy, and consciousness, where he says, I'm paraphrasing, this is how I registered it, because I guess I like it. I'm not sure if it's exactly like this, but that the purest thought is mathematics. And so given what we know today, and in frameworks like TAME, it actually we can read again these texts within, I don't know, a new light. And so we can also ask, is there like a non-Platonic sense now that we know these things, or now that we're tackling the problem from this perspective? I don't know.
I mean, I love the Brouwer reference, so that opens us up onto a whole other world of discussion. And another thing that I know was brought up in the previous discussion would be about mathematics as a language versus, say, natural language, and versus other modes of expression like music or chemical modes of I'm a chemical ecologist, chemical modes of expression, and other things, and whether if we agreed with Brouwer that mathematics is sort of the purest form of thought, is quote unquote nature so pure? So in fact, is that purification a kind of simplification or coarse graining in a way in order to achieve that level of purity and precision? And I think, again, that would bring us back to the history of Platonism in some sense, and this association of the forms with something that's pure, that's not, and I mean, it's not fallen, it's not full of accidents like the world of appearances and all of that. I mean, again, these things get incredibly rich. I also want to talk about what Adam said in the chat about convergent evolution, because I think that's profoundly relevant. And it has been invoked for its relevance to these discussions of Platonism by people like Alfred North Whitehead, but also, in this recent discussion of the Platonic representation hypothesis, right? And I would say, well, there's a lot to say about convergent evolution and the role of shared descent, as well as shared adaptation to the same environment. Things before in a sense we appeal to a kind of Platonic hypothesis that organisms are converging on shared a priori forms. Like we have quote unquote mechanisms or ways of thinking about convergent evolution that don't rely on those. And again, the question is, what's the limit of that, broadly speaking, Darwinian mode of reasoning? I mean, you brought up carcinization. I always like to say, crab forms have evolved like 6 times. Venom, which is one of my areas of study, has evolved more than 100 times independently, right? So, I mean, there are some incredible examples that philosophers could pay attention to when it comes to convergent evolution. But sorry.
Yeah, I think when you look at the sort of 2 different spaces, you can start today formalizing the architecture of how that works. And I think what's really interesting is when you treat these processes as computational and you define what a finite observer, a bounded observer can do in this sort of infinitely complex space of forms, you get this coarse graining and you get this dynamic of trying to sample efficient structures that are very predictable to increase what you can sample later and have more choice. So you get this sort of Darwinian mechanic from the structure of a computational object or a computational possibility space. So the model for observer theory that is based on Stephen's Rouliad, which is computational, and it's really any causal chain. And to make that space have any meaning in physics, it has to close. So you have to be able to get geometry out of it, to get maths out of it, to make physics predictions, which is what Stephen does. That point at infinity gives structure to the space, but it's the point where every causal chain ends, where every diagram commutes, where everything limits. And that's like a sink. And that acts like the idea of this paper is that that acts like a telic attractor. It's like a sort of informational attractor. It's got every possible causal history in it, any multiverse, any type of math, any Platonic form you can imagine, any physical instantiation as an integrated map. And because that map commutes overall, you can say that that structure has that telic pull, that gradient, that fitness, like in a fitness landscape, which is driving observers towards computationally efficient forms that enable them to sample more of that space. And I think the innovation of that computational language allows you to start doing things with the tools we have today, like modeling with LLMs. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment is a test to probe whether different computational architectures that converge. So there's a paper called the Platonic representation hypothesis, and to see if that applies across different architectures for like narrow architectures like AlphaZero or a chess engine, to see if they have a hierarchical mapping of concept space of these embeddings that they have in their models. And I think you can start to probe these objects more today than really any time we've had before now because of the advent of technology. So I think we'll start to get more answers on these sorts of directional questions, whether it has to be separate or it's the same. And I think the idea is that structurally, if there is a structured computational space of or a set of all possible computations, and you can import physics from it, then that structure should be found in a coarse-grained fashion across these sorts of experiments. It won't be definitive, but it will give like a hint that maybe this thing is actually a real thing as opposed to an abstract thing we're constructing to make sense of the world. And I think trying to see if sort of top-down and bottom-up causation can work together, or whether it's really all constructed bottom-up and it's all emergence, is a question that computational experiments are going to let us answer over the next, I think, few years. I think we're going to start getting directional hints about it.
I mean, so my current model, I don't know if this is a chimeric version of the two views that you guys were talking about, or if it's a third thing yet. But it seems to me that there could be a variety of basically it doesn't seem to me like the forms all have to have the same character. Either they're pre-existing and that's it, or they're evolved. It seems to me that there are numerous different ones on that spectrum. So for example, there are biological ones that I'm perfectly happy to have modified by things that have happened, and so evolution and various other things. But there are others that seem like they have a lot less of that character. And so for example, the value of the natural logarithm e, right? That thing, I don't see it being downstream of evolution. I don't see it being downstream of anything that happens in physics. Maybe it can change. I have no idea, but it seems like one of the more stable ones out there. And I think we could say that there are ones that have this like really sort of fundamental stable character. And then there are others that are either novel or modified by things that have happened later. It seems like it's okay to have kind of a diversity of, and this gets into the naming thing, because I originally, when I started talking about this stuff, I originally said Platonic space only because then at least the mathematicians knew what I was getting at, right? Then some percentage of them said, yes, we're already on board with this. But clearly the model that I'm pushing is not fully Plato's model, and so I don't know what to do with the naming of it, and then some people hear Platonic space and they're very upset and they say absolutely not, and I say fine, latent space, yeah, that's good, okay, now we're happy. And I don't know what exactly necessarily they see as the difference, and people also will say, I'll point out certain regularity, certain things that happen where it seems like you get more than you put in, and people will say, well, these are just regularities. I say, what does that mean? Well, these are just things that hold true in our world. Well, what, are those things random? No, they're not random. But I don't want a realm, right? We've got some things that seem to hold true. We don't think they're random, but yet they're not a realm. And so somewhere the terminology, I think we're going to have to work on the different variants of these views to really say, like, what is it that people really hate so much when they think it's a realm, and what else do they have that isn't a realm that to me always sounds like a realm anyway. So I don't know. That's I think the nomenclature is going to need some work here.
I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but when you read Plato's dialogues, there's no one model that Plato leaves us with. He leaves us with many different possibilities. The best criticisms of Plato's forms are in Plato's dialogues. So, but obviously the term Platonism, anyone who's read some philosophy of science and maybe some Karl Popper is going to have a reaction to Plato, all sorts of associations. I understand why you chose that. But you're right, Mike. I'm glad you're pointing to that. There are different forms of forms, as it were. Some which we can understand as historically emergent in a Darwinian sense, and others which seem more necessary or almost metaphysical. And it seems to me that rather than having to choose either variation first in the Darwinist approach or invariance first, which would, we could say be more the Platonist approach, that for variation to lead to anything of significance in terms of historically emergent forms, you already need seeds of invariance. And so there could be some forms that are truly invariant that allow there to be a selection process by which useful forms, other types of forms could emerge historically, right? And so I'm always driven to try to think of the interplay between invariance and variation. It becomes difficult for me to make sense of the idea of a full board Darwinism in the speculative sense of variation first, getting all form out of that because of the examples that you would point to, Mike, that seem not historically emergent. So, I want to have it both ways.
I also want to signal agreement in the sense that it's highly likely, almost certain, that there are those forms which we're not going to get behind, from our position radically, in medias res, right? So what I'm calling this Darwinian mode of reasoning it's a wager, it's a method, it's in some sense, you could think of it as an attempt to identify those forms that we absolutely can't get behind, so which are the ones that are absolutely non-deconstructible in some sense, right? And they may end up appearing to us as kind of conditions of actualization, full stop, or something like that, right? For there to be anything at all, it would appear from our situated perspective that these forms were required. But I mean, there is, of course, a speculative evolutionary account of that. There are anthropic principles. There are still options available in the way we think about those sorts of things. But just to say that it's very different to claim that we can explain everything and we can get to like bedrock variation first and somehow, bootstrap ourselves up to a full cosmos. That's already in some sense the rationalist claim in the history of philosophy. Well, the rationalist claim is that you won't be able to do that, essentially, right? And I am saying there is a limit to the rational and intelligibility of reality. In fact, I tried to say that in my talk for this session. It's like, we are going to have to in some sense recognize those limits, which means there may be things we need to take as given, things that we simply can't explain. But I would just want to signal very much the agreement that it's very clear that there are, different kinds of forms. And I've previously spoken about this and published about this as a kind of temporal hierarchy of constraints. I don't know if I like that term myself. Terminology is always really difficult. But, some forms came into being very, very recently, right? Very recently, some forms are incredibly ancient. And those are obviously real salient differences, and they are going to impinge upon our capacity to give a genetic account of certain forms. Absolutely, yeah.
David?
So let me switch gears a little bit. I'm the philosopher here, but I want to talk about some practical biology for a second. Um, let's imagine ourselves the first cells to come up with the idea of multicellularity, right? And they start communicating in some way, chemically, electrically. What constrains the kinds of shapes that they can make, the kinds of behaviors they can have in this very primitive state? Is there something already there that they can or cannot do? Possibilities they have? Because anyway, Michael, you probably have some thoughts on that.
I'll just throw out one thing because it's the same axe that I always grind, and then probably Tim has other thoughts. There's there's a lot of really good work on bacterial biofilms and things like this that are sort of almost multicellular, and they use some, like Garol Soel does this amazing work showing what he calls brain-like electrical signaling in biofilms that allow them to coordinate and act as a collective and things like that electrically. But one fun thing about the electric side of it is, like, this is one issue that I always talk about, which is how much do you put in and how much do you get out, and what are the examples where you get out more than you put in. So here's an example of this. Once evolution finds a voltage gated ion channel, you've got yourself a voltage gated ion conductance. It's basically a transistor. You have a couple of those, you can make a logic gate. Now you automatically inherit all of these cool things about the truth tables, that NAND is special and all this other stuff. You didn't have to evolve any of that. You get all of those cool properties for free, right? So having made that interface, you now suddenly inherit these things, and you don't have a choice about most of it. Like, that's just what it is from the laws of computation or math or logic or something. And so I think then evolution can make use of all of that, right? And so there will be facts about the way that computation is done in networks of 2D surfaces of biofilms and stuff like that some of it's constraints, some of it's enablements. Some of it you actually get these sort of free lunches that you can, I'm sure Tim's got a bunch of examples that you can make use of. So yeah, I think looking at those bacterial cases is pretty informative there.
And it goes even more earlier than that, right? I mean, when you have genetic regulatory networks, yes, you also have logic gates there too.
Yep. And there's some this stuff isn't published, but I have a student who's looking at training. So we've shown training of gene regulatory network models. She's doing training of Lotka-Volterra style population dynamics, and you can train those too. And if you actually look at the space of parameters of what does it take to make them have habituation, sensitization, these various things, that space is really interesting. It has a very specific, you see very specific shapes in this space. Like, it isn't homogeneous. And where does that come from, right? It's like, it's just like, there it is.
Yeah, I think when I said constraint, I didn't mean not enablement, of course. I meant enabling constraints as always. And I mean, that's the role of invariance that we're talking about here, which is that, you need something to hold things in place so that you can do a kind of theme and variations. I'd love to get to a chat about music here as well, because I know, Mike, you're planning some of those discussions. But to stay with the biology for a second, without getting into heaps of detail, but to respond to what David was saying, I mean, yeah, if like physical, certain physical constraints, enabling constraints are, 13.7 billion years old or whatever, when life, emerges 4+ billion years ago, it has to be in conformity, but it's enabled by those are already the enabling constraints of living systems, right? And then, thinking about things like logic gates and all the amazing stuff that work that Mike has done on the capacities that sort of minimal cognitive systems or minimal biological systems have, etc. I still think we can think about this in terms of relationships of adjacency, right? It's like, we don't have to posit that all of the, Boolean logic associated with the use of, logic gates pre-existed the genesis of that, ion channel or whatever. We can say that in some sense, when you have a certain kind of actualized relational structure in the world, it then brings into definition a set of adjacent possibilities, to use Stuart Kaufman's term, that again, it's hard to understand what it would mean to say that all of that logic pre-existed the logic gate itself. It's like we talk about an interface theory. We're never going to, I mean, it seems to me, pull things out of the Platonic realm, so to speak, without the existence of an interface, in Mike's terms, whose structure, functional, operational capacities is what enables those forms to be ingressed, if we're using that language. But it's a further metaphysical step to say that those forms somehow pre-existed, as opposed to are themselves given a form of definiteness because of their adjacent relationship with that, definitely structured, actual, physical, if you want, interface. And what the Darwinian conception here is saying that interface, it naturally contains within it this potential, which is just variation itself. So if we do look at biological systems and we look at, like, stochastic gene expression and the non-stereospecificity of interactions between molecules, and, Brownian motion in between cells and all this stuff, there's all this like crazy, indeterminate variation going on at all the times, which in a sense you can think of as always spreading out, palpating a space of adjacent possibles from the actual form structure that is in existence. And I mean, it's a little bit of a jump, but I think of this also as the way the sort of mathematical landscape itself expanded in the history of human mathematics, and so we know that there's a whole load of maths that is not applied, that is not physics, right? Physics, the maths of relevance to physics is, this relatively small aspect of the mathematical landscape, and we could therefore get to thinking that, oh well, that's just a subset of something that pre-existed it and is much vaster than it. But if we look at the history of mathematics, it's the other way around. People discovered things in the relations in the empirical world. They learned how to reason about them mathematically. There were, economic and other utilitarian justifications for the development of those tools. And from understanding the principles, like the relational principles diagrammatically, so like Poincaré would say, mathematicians are interested in relations, not objects. You can remove the objects as long as the relations stay the same. It's no different to us. So it's diagrammatic. But by understanding the principles, there's a way that you can keep spreading by unpacking the consequence of those principles. But again, those relationships were found in the empirical world first.
I want to push back on that just a little bit. Okay, so let's get back to our cell forming some kind of a gate, right? It has to be that the potential for on and off is already in the material.
Like resolution, or
it has to be there. There's no making an on and off switch unless the material you're making it with can already be an on and off switch, right?
But you're saying in the material, right? Yeah. So
yeah. No, I'm not saying Plato like out there, but Plato actually in the material itself.
What I'm saying,
right?
100%.
Okay, right. That I can go with that. But when you start talking about, I want to push back on what you're saying about mathematics, because it seems to me that mathematics is not just like a flowering tree that, whatever, that could go in any direction. I think it has a structure to it. I think the way you understand the relationship between, say, geometry and algebra and physics and calculus, the more you look at it, I mean, in group theory and set theory, logic, I mean, there seems to be a structure to it, has some kind of a unity to it. You just can't make up any kind of math you want, right? I mean,
This I think is the issue, right? So Tim, I'm okay with we don't have to say it pre-exists, because I don't know what time would be doing there anyway, so that's fine. It doesn't have to pre-exist, but there's some specificity. In other words, you got this particular fact about NAND, or about that there's 4 color theorems, not the 8 color theorem, it's the 4 color theorem. Like you get a very specific thing out of it, and you can say that it sort of came into being when you made the interface. I'm okay with that, but we still need to say, is it random? And I agree with David. I don't think it is random, right? So there's some pre-exist. So now we're back to like there's some reason why you got this and not something else, right? So something is making that selection.
Yeah, I think random is a very misleading term, like the way random is used in to, talk about indeterminate biological variation, for example. I mean, abject randomness is in some sense an abstract fiction, right? So if I'm going back to biology and I'm talking about stochastic gene expression or whatever, it's not like just anywhere in the universe that those genes are being expressed. It's in a very strict relationship of adjacency with all of the quote unquote machinery that exists to produce those genes. It's just that there's the distribution of genes, the concentration of genes, say in different tissues, different cells, is tightly regulated, but it's never regulated perfectly. It's never regulated absolutely. A protein structure can evolve to achieve a very high degree of specificity, but it's never absolutely specific. There's always this chance that it's just going to stick to something else because molecules are just sticky, and it might have some kind of off-target effect. And that's one of the major ways that novelty emerges in biological evolution, right? So I'm absolutely not saying that it's abjectly random or anything like that. I'm saying as soon as you have any kind of structure, it acts as an enabling constraint on the development of further structure. So it makes complete sense to me that mathematics would have in some sense this kind of unity, and even that complete branches of mathematics that are considered to be completely distinct keep discovering the same structure. Oh, it turns out you can say the same thing in a different language in some sense, right? That makes total sense to me if the fundamental, like if mathematics in some sense is born from this shared origin in the practice of mathematizing humans in like actual contexts. I'm not saying I can, Mike, though, of course, and you and I have been back and forth on this for a couple of years, I think. I'm not saying I have an account on how I would explain the genesis of the 4-color theorem or, Feigenbaum's constants or whatever it is. I'm just saying it seems premature to me to say that no such account is possible. Right.
Yeah. And also, I agree. I guess I tend to agree with opposing views. I like that this example of cells communicating, especially because I don't have a concrete stance, but I asked the question if biological forms, for example, were hearing shapes and not forms, but also in the sense of Mark Cox's question about hearing shapes, that you can effectively recover this geometric information or some sort of data. And since it is persistent, you can also posit that there is some Platonic, like in a Platonic sense, that there seems to be a prior that is somewhere that you can recover consistently, which I find really interesting. And then I asked, okay, perhaps cells, let's speak of like an architecture, like a plant, and you ask if a plant can hear shapes. And in the sense, you just do the same path that Mark Cox did. And indeed, I mean, it's completely plausible if you ought to understand hearing as processing some sort of signal by which, by a mechanotransaction, and then you have like specific genes, and then you have ciliary arrays, and it's completely possible that you would do wavelet transforms. And so, for example, if you want to recover the peaks, of transform like this, that would, for example, modulate the auxin signals, it is completely plausible. It would kind of give you some sort of intervals, and this, in terms of mechanistic expression of a pattern, it is also even plausible that we ought to relate it to symmetry, because the peaks of the Fourier transform, it is completely plausible, and so I would also invite, this other theme, which is Herman's Weyl conception of pure infinitesimal geometry when he was trying to unify the electromagnetic fields. And he came with so many beautiful the constructions and even like, I know we are past the 150 years of Weyl's law, but the fact is that even though, for example, Einstein would comment that his ideas were beautiful, but they were unphysical, and now, prior 150 years later, we have light matter interfaces coming out from it. We have Weyl points that experimentally have been observed, and so perhaps we don't need to choose, between a metaphysical or a physical perspective. There seems to be something here by which we can recover this kind of information, and I find it really interesting for example, on a cognitive level, if we want to bring that, from ciliary arrays, doing this kind of transformations, and then architectures expressing its patterns. I find it interesting, but I don't know how to answer the cell question specifically. On a biological level, I would say.
Let me ask a question about this. What is the difference between a group of cells that are just responding to a chemical stimulus in their environment, like they're moving toward a food source or they're moving away from a toxin, and a group of cells that's actually processing that as information about where they are in the world? Or again, a plant that's growing toward the sun automatically, sort of, or one that's actually processing information about where they are in the world. Michael, you want to take a stab at that?
I'm going to see if I can find a cool example. Have you guys seen the Physarum example that we have? So what you have, it's a dish like this, about 10 centimeters in diameter, and we put 3 glass discs on one end, 1 glass disc on the other end, and a little slime mold in the middle. The glass discs are inert. There's no food on them. There's no chemical anything, right? So what you're going to see, I'm going to try to find this because this has to be seen. But basically, what happens is that for some hours, what the Physarum does is it sort of like, it sits there and it vibrates and it tugs on the gel that the whole thing is sitting on, and it reads, as it turns out, it reads the strain angle of the different masses in its vicinity. And for several hours it does this, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of does this, and basically I think what it's doing is gathering information about the environment, and then it goes preferentially to the heavier mass. So it's very clear. Hopefully, I'll try to find it. But it's very clear that it's got a period where it's gathering info, but it's not actually taking action on it. And then eventually, for whatever reason, it decides to go for it. So that's one of my favorite examples.
Well, it seems that example is crucial for pushing back against the sort of emergence physicalism view, is that if you can experimentally show that organisms are actually representing where they are in the world. I mean, that's very basic math right there, right? I would say that's math. I would say that you have to have some kind of a representation of spatial temporal orientation, if that's what we can actually show you're doing.
So here it is, right? These are the glass discs here, right? 3-1, and this is the little Physarum. So for the first few hours, it just kind of does this, right? And it's sort of going everywhere at once. And I have a video where you can actually see it like tugging, and then boom. Then at that point it decides to go for it, right?
Wow.
Like all of
this. That looks, yeah.
Right. And then bang, that's what it'll do.
it's
And
sort of doing a random walk in a sense, and then
yeah, exactly.
suddenly it becomes oriented. And I think this is really fascinatingly consonant with, say something like Waddington's conception of the neutral accumulation of genetic variation, and then the reconfiguration of the epigenetic landscape, if you want, but the process of genetic assimilation when an organism enters into a particular environment and something elicits that adaptation from it. And so this is a big, as Mike knows really well, these are very big and ongoing conversations in sort of evolutionary theory around things like evolvability, the role of redundancy, the role of robustness, and where those two things are the same and where they're different, and all of that. But this capacity to kind of do something. Look, I'm always wiggling my hands like this, like I'm a big gesticulator. This is quote unquote random behavior, stochastic, spontaneous behavior. But if suddenly something elicited a reaction from me, I might point directly, or I might make a shape with my hands or something like that. My point there is just that biological systems are like always doing this spontaneous thing, at the molecular level, at the behavioral level, etc. They're reaching out, they're palpating an environment, and they're seeking a signal to bring this into the information territory. They're seeking something which would tell them go this way and not that way, be this and not that. This is what you need to be right now. You've got this capacity to be lots of different things. You're phenotypically plastic, but right now this would be a good thing to be. And so information then is this relational thing that happens between two different systems, if you want, organism and milieu, or two different organisms, whatever. And it's a mutual reciprocal relationship of elicitation in a sense, right? When the signal comes in and it is quote unquote meaningful because of a bunch of other things that are going on, like because that plant actually requires light in order to photosynthesize because of its evolutionary, um, that's how I tend to think about these sorts of things, and I think it's fascinating. And I think again, Mike, your work is incredibly pioneering in this way. That you can look at the slime mold, and on the one hand, you could actually have told this story maybe at the molecular level, and it would almost be a kind of evolvability story. Then like the states of the slime mold are evolving, but you could tell the same story but at a different level, or in a different aspect, in a way which becomes a behavioral story or a cognitive story. And so there's this fascinating unification of a kind on offer there. And it turns out that I've said this to you before, Mike, but there's a way of thinking about cognition which I think in this general framework that you give us, in which it almost becomes synonymous with what evolution means, if you think about evolution in a really generic sense. To Sam's point, and I feel like, Sam, you said some really fascinating stuff about Wolfram's model and computation that we haven't picked up on. But computation is an evolutionary process, like always already, right? Like it's no shock if there's a really intimate relationship between evolution and computation, because they've always been intimately related. And you can even just go into the history of the word evolutio and how it means unfolding, but it has an algebraic connotation before it ever had a connotation in biology, blah blah blah. Like there's so many rich resonances here. I also just want to say that I wouldn't want to be seen here as flying the physicalist flag, right? Let's just be clear. I'm not advocating for some kind of physicalism. I actually think physicalism is more Platonic and more idealistic. I know that's counterintuitive, than the quote unquote Darwinism or Darwinian or whatever. I call it ontogenetic, actually, because I prefer not to invoke Darwin's name so often, because it's like invoking Plato's name. People are like, oh, that's what this means. So an ontogenetic alternative. It's definitely not what I would call physicalism, because I think physicalism is a formal theoretical approach to a way of understanding the world, basically grounded in effective theory. That's a whole other conversation. But I'm not aligning myself with that. But I'm saying this is a genuine, well, maybe it's a genuine alternative.
I think like one of the things that's interesting is you can model sort of evolutionary processes on very basic cellular automata. And when you talk about sort of patterns, you get this linear progression, then some exponential jump as that cellular automata discovers a novel rule that increases the amount of steps they survive for. And those jumps are sort of discrete, right? And those discrete jumps are really when we say the object has changed from one thing to the other. So in your cell question, the idea of sort of bulk orchestration or top-down causation from a group of objects that have sort of bound together exhibited small world network properties where, you know, the communication channels reach some synchronicity that means that decision is basically everywhere in the network all at once. It's called a superlinear speed up. And that sort of dynamic gives you that top-down causation where that single cell thing has within it the sort of communication ability, the ability to couple and find information from the environment or from other cells in its neighborhood. Once enough of them come together and they're close enough, that orchestration kicks in, and that's where those free lunches come in, because you've now got to a different sort, you've exponentially risen up the curve of how much information you can handle, how big your internal model is, how much you can predict. And here, the model is that this world of, you know, latent space, idea space, possibility space, whichever sort of name you want to give it, that structure is invariant, and objects are bigger or smaller based on how many equivalences there are within the computational network. Now, it's not saying the actual thing is a big computer. It's saying that that model is a coherent way to then make predictions with it in a way that, you know, this is the language of these formalisms from Plato to even theologies, right? All the metaphysics of all the major theologies describe the structures of these spaces. And I think today with these sort of network models, you can now be more specific, and you can now test things like evolution through that space. What if you have an object with n many equivalences in the network? Does an agent put in that space discover it faster or slower? You test, you can actually start to, you know, run quite coarse simulations of the dynamics of this space that I think for a long time have just been talked about. And that's really interesting because all of the experiments that are coming out of like Michael's lab, lots of the other people on this panel are pointing in that direction. And I think it's a super interesting formal program where these sorts of things can be tested, not just in sort of observers like us or animals, but they can be tested across novel substrates like computers. Like you can start to answer that question. And when you have a structured space like that, then you start to ask deeper questions like, are ethics computationally valid? Can you model ethics computationally? If so, can you teach a computer them? And those sorts of languages you get out of discovering this sort of space is causally effective. It might, you know, whether it's ontologically real, there's, you know, a giant Indra's net all around us is hard to tell. But, you know, whether it's causally effective in our world is probably the more important question that we can, I think, start answering, and the people in this panel have basically been working on. So I think that's the most interesting thing that's happened in the past 2 years that starts to let all of these ideas sort of start to bring ideas of infinitary space and infinitary explanation back into physicalism in a way that should be quite explanatory and I think quite helpful.
I think that's beautifully put, and I really agree with the promise for that new kind of science, you know, that sort of experimental computational method. And I do think it gets sometimes that promise, that potential gets collapsed a little bit when we immediately feel the need to move into a kind of metaphysical territory and say, well, that means that, you know, the universe is a computer or whatever it is. I think it's an incredible way of experimentally testing various evolutionary models, because they're all evolutionary to me, right? Because intrinsically, computational models are evolutionary. And I love what you said about, you know, saltations, jumps, phase shifts, you know, leaps in a state space. And I think we see a ton of that in biological evolution, actually. So I don't think that the so-called gradualist assumption particularly holds. It holds on certain scales, but we also see a lot of leaps. And what I brought up with genetic assimilation and Waddington, Richard Goldschmidt's idea, these ideas have always been present in evolutionary theory, even though there had been a sort of mainstream of neo-Darwinism that tried to squash them for whatever reason. But yes,
I think that dynamic's not just seen across biology, it's seen in our social structures, it's seen in how we organize itself, it's seen in how economic growth is, it's seen in how political systems and change works. We have a long linear progression or some sort of mildly chaotic but linear progression. and then there's a change, and there's an exponentialization. The network reorganizes, it settles to a new local, loop, a new peak, or valley in the fitness landscape, depending on which way around you've got it. And then it keeps going. But this applies not just in evolution, because it's computational, and ultimately we compose our explanations computationally to communicate them. That dynamic, if it's proved in computation in the most simple system, must be running in more complex systems at much higher resolution. So these dynamics can now be explored in that sort of space of memetics, that sort of Dawkins, sentence in the book that should have probably been another book in Susan Blackmore's work. They now become causally effective if you can also put physics within that same language. And that's sort of one of the interesting things about these sorts of models, right? It's not, I think, that you can now compose between those structures. And because there's a natural geometry inherited in those sorts of objects, you can compare the properties. And so you can have, ideas about symmetries, ideas about sort of the boundaries of those objects and how hard they are to sort of capture, how much coarse graining goes on, what happens when we actually sample these objects. Do they become easier or harder to sample? Is there a point where that changes, where that object becomes invariant under repeated sampling, so that we know it's sort of maximally reduced for us? What happens to that sort of concept in Platonic space when that happens? And it starts to put these observer-centric models as explanatory in the context of how we interact with information that isn't wholly explained by just physics, biology, chemistry. The content of an emotional experience can be explained with an EEG, but if you ask someone the contents of that experience and you say, is this data, unspooled all the data, you will normally get an answer that's no. And because of this language, because you can now compose those things in sort of an integrated map, you can start to make harder empirical statements about what you think the structure of that space is. Whether or not the space is structured how my paper hypothesizes it or speculates is beside the point. It's that you can speculate within this architecture all of those sorts of dynamics to try and formalize and test these sorts of, I think, sometimes quite intuitive, but also informed by lots of experience, ideas about metaphysical, bigger questions that are harder to answer. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this sort of change in the language, because it starts to join up so many different domains, and you start to get ideas that are that are mathematically proven, that can be applied across spaces and concepts that don't normally seem to lend themselves to it, at least in how we think about those subjects today. And I think that's quite an interesting thing about this sort of symposium, is that you get those perspectives on what those optimal models are from 20 different disciplines in sort of 20 different languages. And so you get this sort of coming together, pulling apart those ideas, which is how you formalize something like this, which I think is going to be quite important over the next few years.
Let me ask you what you think about, I don't know about biology, but let's say the easier models. Let's take two different neural network, two different architecture of neural network trained on the same data set. They probably or not, I don't know, what do you think? They create a different world perception or not? That's the same data set.
Yeah, this has been tested, right? So above a certain amount of tokens, large language models trained on transformers have convergent representations in their weights. This was a result from last year. And they've now applied that test slightly more broadly with some different measures across a couple of vision, multimodal, so vision and transformer-based word architectures, where again they're finding some, in that paper it's called universal subspace, these sorts of areas where the representations converge. Now, whether or not that's constructed in the data set, i.e. because we've chucked in all of our pictures, our words, etc., it comes out like that because of us, or it's discovered, is not yet an answered question. nor is how that space is structured or the properties of that space, because those architectures, they find it harder to import coherent geometry across different models and different types of design. There's a guy called Marcus Buehler who does some really excellent work on this. I think he's at MIT, who's done, and he's sort of been doing graph theoretic representations of these concept spaces. But really what you're trying to do is move past that test to whether, trying to figure out if you can test whether there's some sort of discovery or some construction where the domains are so separate that, okay, it might point to it, but if it's totally different training data or it's a narrow domain, is there a structural discovery, not what's in the structure, but is there order or is there hierarchy that suggests that this Platonic space is not just words, there's sort of and steel girders holding it up that say this is roughly how we split things up.
Right, but since it's large language models, I suspect that the shared commonality between the models have something influence on the creation of that kind of concepts, Platonic world. But I'm saying, assuming that you have a completely different model that doesn't learn based on attention, I don't know, learn on something else. Does if they create the same world, does it mean that there is only one Platonic presentation of the world and we just need to find that world, or there is many and they just accidentally know to bridge the gap between the two?
I guess the way to think about it is in terms of like the size. So the form of a chair is, as an object informationally, bigger than all the elements of that set, or that that category of the form of the chair. So every individual chair that you can possibly imagine is contained within that object. And so when you have a word, imagine that as an object like a category. Now it's a smaller category than maybe chair, it's a more bounded category. There's less sort of things it connects to than, or less instantiations of it, but it's still got to be mapped, and you're only mapping with a lens that's small. And so you're mapping sort of an object, okay, it might be countably infinite or even finite in terms of the composition of it, but you're counting it with something that's doing it one at a time. And so you're not going to ever fully map that space. So even with something as simple as a word, you're going to get multiple embeddings, but they'll be close together in that space. And similarly, as you move down to things in physics, well, those things will become discrete. And why is math powerful? Because it's you get an answer. So those objects become invariant, and you can map them fully, which is why they're useful to, like, in the computational observer model. Because if you have finite computational power, you need to do more mapping. You want to go and see more of the space. You want to reduce or compress as much of that into your model, and it's sort of a discrete measure version of something like FEP, where that surprise is I have to do a lot of computational work to fit this object into my model, and then I need to make it smaller and compress it. So when I sample that thing again, when I practice doing something, or when I learn something, that thing gets compressed more, get more equivalences in the object. It becomes easier for you to integrate into your world model to make predictions with.
Right.
And so that sort of dynamic means you map that space. Yeah, even though that object exists, you're not going to fully map it or perfectly map it with a finite budget.
I think it's such a good question, Hananel, and it was a great answer also, Sam. It's fascinating, your work. In going back to your question, Hananel, I wonder sometimes the same, and I guess experimentally, it could be interesting to test for something that, because in terms of computation or computational power, in terms of operation, not only you have allocation operations, you have this thermodynamic or dissipation layer at play, which, depending on where is the model being run, or what are the computational constraints of the architecture, I wonder sometimes if it's more related, or if it's also related, not just with the words, but also with, let's call it the kernel dissipation, in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess at the moment, so in the last couple of years, a lot of really talented researchers have come up with sort of multiple measures to kind of figure out this stuff. So some are kernels, some are, you know, the graph representation, and there are, I think, 5 or 6 different measures, and really what you're trying to do is get to the right measure for it at the moment, where at the moment it probably is some composite of those measures. And, you know, it's in fact the thing I'm working on at the moment. So it's a very live question for me, and something that I need to get to a tighter answer on.
Yeah, because I guess like in terms of computational topology, let's call it, and we can find like defects, or you know, and you can do eigencompositions or expansions. It feels really interesting to see what would be the form in pointed spaces, for example, and the density, and also articulate with the volume and area proportionality, like in Weil's law.
This is one of the interesting things about like an LLM's architecture, because it's very complex, like reducing that to, you know, non-trivially from, you know, n-dimensional many weights to some 3D representation or some, you know, n-dimensional. It's hard. So I think there's a bit of work to do, but what's quite interesting at the moment is a lot of people are working on sort of geometric computational engines for inference or for fusing off of like virtual machines to and these create maps where they pre-fuse computation, where that representation, because it's a coherent map that sort of has, you know, easy composition between it, might be more able to accurately map that sort of, you know, physical representation of a shape like that with those properties. But it's a bit early. They're still in, it's like a really interesting foundation called UOR.
I mean, it is. I don't know, because it is, and also perhaps you would get more discernment in terms of temperature, of effective temperature measures you want to take. Because I've been experimenting with Mike's data, especially because of the bioelectric code. And the problem is that normally you have on a substrate, it seems, you know, the same temperature, or the same temperature will get you, you know, a very large spectra, and then you cannot make heads or tails with it. But if you make this sort of discernment between what would be an effective temperature of a bioelectric wave, and you take it and you discern it from the medium, you get a much narrower space. And it's, at least, even though it is early, but it's kind of like an inverse problem that, you know, maps exactly to what you were saying. But in, for example, cell-cell communication, or, you know, a damaged embryo, and you kind of like discerning the mechanical wave of an embryo trying to in intercell communication. But so I'll keep also a look in your work, I guess.
Really fascinating stuff. Returning to one of the broader themes of the conversation, but you know, a couple of things that you were saying, Sam, including when you initially brought up, you know, Wolfram models in your first contribution, and talking about convergence, basically. I mean, one of the things I think in the history of philosophy, that these conceptions that start with, say, notions of infinity, like an infinite plenitude of forms, for example, struggle with is what I call like the selection problem, right? You know, it's so you end up with an issue of like, why these forms and not that forms. You know, this is something that you know, I'm not sure if Matt's actually there at the moment, but Alfred North Whitehead speaks to very directly. And I think, you know, this is a problem that you get like in string theory, right? You know, like there are so many different solutions for the vacuum. Why this particular one? And so you end up with a formal system that's of course capable of encompassing the actual world in some sense, at least at the level of the abstract language that it's using, but it is radically underdetermined by the world in some sense, right? You know, it encompasses much more than the world, and you have this problem of selection. And this is somewhat related to what you said subsequently after I mentioned, you know, saltation, where you mentioned, you know, these leaps in cellular automata. And then you were saying it's a general phenomenon, which I completely agree about. And again, you know, phase shift, criticality, all of that sort of stuff. We all, I think, acknowledge that these are a general phenomena, but the way they tend to be explained is in a kind of, you know, Hermann Haken synergetics kind of way that, you know, there's a decay of the order parameters, the system goes into a kind of more chaotic phase of its evolution, and then it's captured by another attractor. It leaps in the landscape. You know, you mentioned a fitness landscape, could be an energetic landscape, whatever, to another attractor, another basin of attraction, and it ends up there. And now the new non-equilibrium steady state that defines it is there for it. And you know, this comes up when Carl Friston talks about these things a lot as well. And you mentioned the FEP in passing, but certainly his contributions to the previous Platonic Space discussion, but also a discussion I had with him and Mike and Chris Fields on Mike's channel a while ago now. You know, the real question I think we're butting up against in this discussion of the Platonic space is, yeah, but where do those attractors come from? Like, if you can explain all the behavior in terms of attractors, you know, these models coming out of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, historically, they have relied on, as physicalist models tend to, a predefined space where the attractors are essentially, you know, always already there, and then you can model the evolution of a system through that landscape, and it's, you know, captured by this one or captured by that one. And what such a model struggles to deal with, again, is the actual genesis of those attractors. And so again, the question of the genesis of forms arises. It's really the same question.
Yeah, but that's that's what religious metaphysics literally does in every single form of persistent theology. You know, the big major, I'm going to call it the monotheisms plus sort of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism as the, well, you know, maybe that's a shorter list than maybe, but they, I think, culturally are the sort of biggest and most persistent structures, and they all do that in their metaphysics. So they all have their own sort of, in the language of those traditions, their own world of forms, their own way of that structure, and whether that structure was there at the point of the sort of initial teaching, it normally got formalized like maybe 1,000 years after the tradition gets started, and, you know, philosophical traditions where they start to deepen these spaces, and they all talk about this evolution of this possibility space, you know, from the 1 to the 2 to the 10,000 things in Kabbalah, from, you know, from sort of these sort of unending infinite through some contraction to the biggest infinite objects we've got. In Hinduism, it's the sort of tattvas and Brahman and Atman and how those work together. They all do it, and they all have this very loose language, but that language can be, you know, expressed computationally within that sort of model. It's basically categorical. It's saying these are infinitary categories of things. Okay, it's not the whole thing, but you can now create a coherent model of how this sort of selection principle applies to an infinite object, because an infinite object, if you're going to posit that at the very top of the chain, which is what all these persistent things do, give or take some nuance on Buddhism, apologies to any Buddhists out there, then you need to be able to sort of walk through that process. But this infinite thing must do it infinitely fast, or as fast as possible, or at least until, in some traditions, you get to us and we get free will and kind of get choice. But that sort of conception and that problem, you can now at least attempt to bridge it with these sorts of models, where this Platonic space and the coherence across not just all the religions, but Greek philosophy, aspects of you know, sort of the chakra system all across the world. If these attractors are real and these forms are real, the linguistic construction around the names or what those attractors tell you to do as the sort of suborder rules for that person are less important than there is a structure that seems to be consistently created or discovered. Again, this creation, you know, constructed versus discovered point is critical, because the question is really, is this space closed or is it open? Now, something like postmodernism and philosophy functions this way in this sort of model. It kind of goes, what's my biggest possibility space or my biggest model that I can search with, that I can explore with, that I can exploit, use to structure my space. And we get to postmodernism, which is effectively, and this is a loose weakly equivalent analogy, but it's like the mathematical equivalent of like an open category, like an ever branching tree where at the very limit it doesn't come together. Every computation is infinitely far away from everyone else, so there's no speed ups at the limit. It's all irreducible, all devolves to randomness. And then you get like this is sort of a, if you were thinking about it as a network structure, you know, like I'm really picking on like a deconstructivist's view of postmodernism and not constructivist postmodernism. So give me the breather, because I know it's a controversial thing to say, but these convergent ideas, whether it's Plato, whether it's religions, whether it's Leibniz, whether it's Spinoza, they didn't have a way to create the architecture of those structures in a way that was coherent with maths, physics, computation, sciences of their time, because the language wasn't there.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a position today where you have tools in language and tools and results in empiricism where these things get connected. And so you can now start to express an argument, not a proof or not, you know, but a coherent, internally consistent structure that says we can work through how Platonic space has these forms. You may not agree with it, and it may make, you know, axiomatic or metaphysical assumptions like, you know, take away sort of theism. There's some bucket of infinite information or, you know, structured space that we are discovering. That's like a fundamental brute fact axiom. You go to the other view, the brute fact axiom of sort of materialism is there's a singularity or something at the Big Bang, or the universe was always there, or in a block universe, or in a multiverse. So you accept different brute facts to do that, but it's an interesting exercise because I think it speaks to intuitions and structures that we continually create, but don't have, you know, process-based explanations for in any sort of formal language. Or like, and I don't mean like logic, I mean like this connects directly to results in maths, physics, chemistry, and it's the same dynamic, not a different dynamic. And I think that's what you can do in it.
Yeah, I substantially agree with the vast majority of that. I mean, you're advancing a kind of perennialist thesis on the history of religion. I published a paper several years ago on creation myths and evolutionary process. And so I absolutely agree that all those myths can be decomposed into operators. And I think that's actually what metaphysics is. Like the explicit practice of metaphysics is the decomposition of myth into operators in some sense. That's what I call diagrammatic metaphysics anyway. And certainly that's what Plato was doing with the Timaeus. And, you know, Aristotle was very, very good at coming up with these diagrammatic schemas, like his, you know, four causes and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I substantially agree with everything that you're saying. I think, yeah, again, can the computational approach, which I hold out great promise for, and I think you're absolutely right in all those things you're saying. You know, can it move us? Well, how far can it move us? It's a similar question to the kind of what I was calling a Darwinian approach, in the sense like how far can it move us out of that, and to what extent will it still be reliant on taking certain invariants for granted, and to what extent could we say that that is not unrelated to the physical structure of the computational object itself, you know? And so it's not going to get us out. I don't think it's going to really get us out of ask if one is so inclined, asking those big metaphysical questions. The other thing I just point out, which is just really adjacent to what you were saying anyway, is that physicalism is already it's a monotheistic mode of reasoning that comes directly out of you know, Christian and scholastic philosophy. And so, you know, people like Newton certainly, but like Laplace, they did have they developed themselves, but a highly developed mathematical language for trying to bring together a certain conception of theology with their physical science. I mean, that was their project in many ways. And that's what I also explicitly critiqued in my talk for this seminar, for this symposium. But I think, yeah, to your broader point, really important to recognize the theological origins of the theological or mythological origins of most of these thought forms. I mean, I want to hear Matt weigh in on this because this is something that he has a massive amount to say about as well.
Yeah, and it was very, very interesting. I'm glad this connection is arising. And I guess what comes to mind now is, Tim, you and I were talking offline about the difficulty of putting some of these ideas into natural language. And, we're searching for diagrams, we're trying to formalize this, and yet we also want to be able to communicate meaningfully about uh, how it changes our self-understanding as human beings. And so I wonder about whether metaphysics can just be understood as a translation of these mythic intuitions, so to speak, into some kind of formal operation or set of operations. But, if we go back to Plato, it seems to me he's never trying to translate one into to the other, but instead to sort of play them off each other. Like, let's see how far dialectics can get us, and it's still a natural language, but he was using the geometry available to him at the time, like in a dialogue like Timaeus, to work out some of the ratios he was perceiving in just the movements of the wanderers, the planets through the fixed stars, and so on. And yet, in almost every dialogue, dialectic ends in aporia, rationality meets its limits, and then he offers a myth, which in some sense illustrates symbolically, imaginatively, what reason can't quite grasp because it is inherently limited. And earlier, Tim, you said that rationalism meets this limit. And I think all the best rationalists from Plato to Hegel, if I can call Hegel a rationalist, and Hegelians wouldn't be happy about that, but they recognize that the recognition of the limit is already to overcome the limit. And so I think rather than imagine we might ever get out of myth, my own orientation as a more or less Neo-Platonist, which I think it's very hard to think outside the grammar that Plato left us, whether you're in the West or even in the Islamic world. I mean, there's just so much that's structured and canalized by Plato's way of thinking. Um, at the end of the day, we're not going to get out of the need for myth. And however science advances, we're still going to need to tell ourselves a story about what those formalisms and what the math means.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree that myth has a very pressing and ongoing role. I mean, we may slightly disagree in what that role is, but I yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, I just want to throw this back to Sam because earlier you were saying that, if you show someone an EEG, they would say that doesn't really explain my experience to me. That's sort of, paraphrasing what you were saying. That doesn't seem to represent my experience. Um, I think one of the things we're always running up against, and this is Matt's point about what we were discussing offline in terms of trying to express these things in natural language, is again that we have a bunch of different modes of expression, and you can think about them as different languages if you want. But I said this earlier, I suppose, but I feel very strongly, just to bring this up, I can say things when I'm improvising as a musician that I would never be able to say in natural language, but they're nonetheless like I'm expressing something, there's something non-overlapping. And I guess I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but Sam, but I would worry about any claim that sort of a computational language could become a sort of master discourse in a way, right? That the computational language would succeed where, say, the EEG didn't. It would certainly explain different things, and it might have vastly more.
It's your point. Yeah, it's your point. It's that it explains a different layer in an
Yeah,
integrated fashion, as
yeah,
opposed to saying this is explaining everything. Like the internal part of the function, right? Like if you imagine like an observer sort of theory perspective is you're this complex observer with your big cognitive light cone of all the causal history that's built you up. and you have some boundary of what you can compute now, and then you have some limit that you've set in your world model of what you think is possible to compute or what you think you can see. Things like myth and religion and even superstructures like fascism, nationalism, socialism, they all function as limit setting devices to coordinate observers in that space to try and get them to go the quickest route, or what they deem with their limited world model is the fastest route. So it's effectively selection and evolution all the way to the birth of myth. And you see it in evolutionary, in sort of how religions evolve through time, and there are loads of papers, loads of books on this. But you start with small conceptions, and eventually what survives is a big conception. So the role of myth is it's like the top down, our cognitive apparatuses top down way to set the biggest space. And when you get to the limit of that space through our sort of the way our apparatus works, the way our brains work, because we can't really explain things well beyond causation, beyond input, function, output, cause, effect, because we can't really get beyond that boundary. That's where the sort of proto myth, or like these bigger conceptions of one substance or onism or unity, have that utility, because they have a computational function in the way a bounded observer computes limit objects. They can actually compute it. They can say, oh, this infinite thing I can't compute, it's equal to 1. You know, like to get my computation to complete, like that's a very sort of trite example, but that's sort of the rough idea of how these things function in this sort of object.
So I wonder if it would be useful in the context of being interested in explanation in particular to pin down and distinguish different types of explanatory why questions or different types of targets. So what I often see in my space is an interest in capturing what's distinct about genuine, legitimate explanations, what doesn't count as an explanation. And there's an appreciation that not just scientists and humans in everyday life, we ask different types of questions about even what we think of as the same system in the world. Like we ask different questions about gene expression, or pick the physical stuff of interest, but there's different types of questions. So sometimes we might ask a causal question or a functional question, or a question that requires some kind of optimality or efficiency answer. And we think of those as very different types of explanatory why questions. And we think of explanations as answers to those questions. And the frameworks that were very nicely listed out, mechanical philosophy, forms coming from, Platonic frameworks, those are sometimes pitched as associated with different types of questions. But we think, you can't give an explanation for something unless you specify a well-defined explanatory target. And there's very different types of targets that are showing up, of course, in these discussions. And we think of them as different types of explanatory why questions. And I wonder if it would be useful to, right? One of them is, why does this form exist versus it exists? Why does it change the possibility space of what can, or we think of those as, they're of course very different questions about something, but they're also, we often, a standard causal explanation isn't wired up to handle that possibility space question in the standard way we think about causal explanation. So it also relates really nicely to this challenge of words and terminology, because it shows up with mechanism 2, mechanical philosophy. That means about 800 different things to about 800 different people. And so getting the precision for what do we mean when we say constraint or mechanism, I wonder if one way to start wrangling that is to potentially distinguish different types of explanatory targets. But I totally appreciate that. It's so interestingly challenging to find the right term to start with before you even unpack. And metaphysics is coming up too. That's going to mean very different things to different. So, yeah, definitely interested in thinking about all of those more. But we don't think there's just causal explanation. There's lots of fascinating debates now about non-causal mathematical explanations, or functional evolutionary explanations are viewed as distinct from the standard causal. Also mechanism, of course, so yeah, lots of interesting, complicated things. And yeah, just this question about the potential use of distinguishing different types of explanatory targets.
Well, I think that's a really excellent question. I mean, I would sort of go with a more of a pluralistic approach. As someone mentioned, the four causes of Aristotle's four causes. I mean, the way I would look at it is that it's kind of like what's most useful for guiding particular kinds of research programs and experiments you're doing. And I think with Michael Levin's work, at least, I've had some conversations with him. The move toward teleological and functional explanation is driven by pragmatics. It's like there's just provides a certain kind of guidance for hypothesis testing and model formation that's very useful. So that, when you're stuck with causal explanations of what he's trying to deal with, it just really is very difficult to explain, like trying to explain how a computer works without allowing yourself to talk about software, right? It's just not very useful, right? And actually, this gets back to Sam's discussion of computation. The whole computational angle on this is that what makes an explanation useful is partly how we are able to use it, manipulate it in our minds, understand it. And that gets back to issues of computation. Things just get to be so complicated that we just can't deal with them, right? Maybe an AI can, but we can't.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to understand a strategy scientists use to manage complexity is they pick explanatory targets that are precise, and they specify them in a way that's very narrow. And so that anchors what they want to explain. And there's lots of detail that now they can say, that doesn't matter. I'm not, that isn't a difference maker for this target. But then what can happen is sometimes they stray from that target they started with, or we try to like lump everything in the kitchen sink into the explanatory target, and you just can't, at least the way I think of explanation, you can't give a explanation of everything about a system. There isn't a like complete whole explanatory target that you give a complete, it's not even a well-defined question. And so it's only once you specify that you could ever give an answer. But sometimes it's hard to define that target in a way that's well defined, and then it's hard to stick with it, right? Because we might start with saying, I'm going to give an explanation for why this form explains this set of potential outcomes. And then someone's like, well, what explains the existence of that form? And it's like, well, okay, we've changed the explanatory target now. So you're asking a new question, and it's sort of like, we got to change the goalpost. Or there's this interesting attempt to like put it all into like, let's give the whole explanation. And I mean, there's debates about maybe with the standards that a kind of explanatory target should meet, and also what notions of causation are useful. I definitely like the pragmatic. I'm not sure we should be, I'm not sure Aristotle's four causes are what scientists currently use, or what are going to get us reaching the goals we want. So it's also, which of these frameworks do we want to use, or do we need to develop them or change them or add to them, or just say like, I'm not gonna, this is the notion of form, I mean, and it's different from this interpretation of Plato or whatever.
Well, I could see having a whole zoo of of explanatory frameworks, right? Explaining things in terms of different phenomena and different levels of organization and things like that. I mean, actually, we've seen that in biology. We see that in biology of all the different levels of organization. You can explain things in biology. So I'm perfectly happy to be very pragmatic and pluralistic about that. I don't see anything all that wrong with it either. And you talk about you mentioned, getting things very simple and then finding the problems when you do that. I mean, sometimes that's what you need to get a program going, right? So look at something like behaviorism in psychology, right? Well, they turned out to be badly wrong, but about a lot of things, short-sighted. But for a while they had it going pretty good, right? They were able to get a lot done with just a very simple way of explaining, say, animal behavior. Made a lot of progress, and then they made that progress, and then people said, "Hey, wait, this doesn't explain this. It doesn't explain that. You need to go beyond behaviorism." I guess I'm not disagreeing with you in any way.
I think it's such an important contribution, and I think we end up potentially talking past each other or just muddying the waters continuously to the extent that we don't get clear about the kinds of questions that we're trying to ask, and recognizing that as researchers coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, our kind of default mode of explanation or suite of explanations may be really quite different. So as a biologist, one might think, well, look, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of function. Like if I want to know why an organism has a trait, the character state that it has, I might really need to appeal to a kind of functional explanation in order to feel that I've explained that. But a physicist might not really have the intuition for that mode of explanation at all. So we might, where a physicist is saying, no, we can explain it at this lower level, and maybe that would correspond to a causal explanation. The two intuitions can just be gliding off each other. And this is, one reason why, biology isn't reducible to physics in some important sense, right? Because we do deploy very different, explanatory modes. We ask different kinds of questions. But, one of the things that happens a lot in this specific context, in my opinion, is that there's a kind of an appeal to instrumentalism. There's this is the most useful kind of approach, and that's going to be what adjudicates whether or not I employ it or whether or not I use it. But then there's always, in these broader conversations, there's always a kind of subtle sliding over into, now I'm talking about the nature of reality. And I can't tell necessarily when, because it isn't clearly specified, when we've moved from this is a useful methodological approach in some scientific domain to now I or someone is making a claim about, and therefore this is a statement about the nature of reality as such. And to the extent that those things get muddied, well, we have a lot of problems. We've had problems historically, and we still have problems with a sort of, let's call it a reification, if you want, of a methodological stricture. Like maybe the mind-body problem would be, I'm not going to, we don't need to get into that, but certain things have been methodologically excluded so that science can proceed in a certain way, so that we can ask very clear questions. But then there is this tendency, and maybe we just have it as natural language users and humans who have been shaped by thousands of years of attempting to, through myth and all this stuff we're talking about, attempting to understand our status, our relationship to the rest of the world and all of that. We have this tendency to kind of forget at some point that that was a methodological exclusion. And all of a sudden we're saying, well, metaphysically, that's just epiphenomenal, or that's just not a thing, that's just woo-woo, whatever it is, right? And we don't notice. And so, Lauren, I'm really just in an extended way saying, thank you for that contribution, because it's incredibly important and something that I think about a lot. And I need to read your book, by the way. But yeah, different modes of explanation just within biology are very important to me. And even just, basic Dennettian distinction between the how come and the what for, or whatever, Really, really important for us to get clear on that. And when I brought up the little typology at the beginning, and I said, mechanical philosophy and Plato and blah, 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 I did say without getting into unpacking exactly what these mean, because that would be like a whole presentation in and of itself in some sense, right? But it then becomes really important. We've got a few options here. Now we do the diagramming. How do these operators work in each of these things? And so then we can ask, what does each of these potential modes of explanation afford us? What can we not ask when we're thinking in this way, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, just really agree.
Yeah, I wonder one way that this can help too in presenting work to audiences for the first time or audiences that are critical is to suggest that it isn't intended to explain everything, right? This is intended to explain a certain kind of thing, certain kind of explanatory target. And sometimes there's this criticism of, well, it doesn't do this though. And it's like, that's fine. It's not supposed to. And if you expect that there's a single framework that should explain everything, that's not that accurate of how we think about of what scientists are doing and the massively complicated and different types of questions. So it can be protective, and maybe it can also satisfy that audience because it's like, look, this isn't, we're not saying this is the way to do all explanations, but it does this thing. And yeah, I wonder if there's a way to specify. I totally appreciate the just assumption that science and the methods that we use and maybe the like utility element should be of a certain kind. I mean, I wonder if it's related to just reductive assumptions too, where the way you understand everything is by just going further down always. But yeah, I wonder if there's a way to specify the goals that are associated with these explanations such that you could say it is useful for these goals, even if it's not useful for like those ones you're interested in.
But those
But
nonetheless valid goals, right?
yeah, they could, yeah, that's the interesting place where that's the hard part is arguing about the goals. The easy part is once you fix them, we can say, well, look, my method, my approach gets you to these goals in a more objective way, and yours doesn't. But honestly, words, there's these fascinating discussions I have with scientists where causation they think of as like the only way explanations work. And so they want their model to be a causal model. It's a dynamical, I mean, we think of it as explanatory. It's of course very informative and useful. They want it to be called a causal model because of that word, because that word to them means it's a real explanation. And so there's really interesting issues with just these words have a status, and dealing with that is totally non-trivial and fascinating. Yeah, sorry, Matt.
Baggage, right? Philosophical baggage, those terms. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I love that we've ended up here because to me this speaks precisely to the importance of distinguishing between metaphysics and the special sciences, where each of the special sciences is trying to offer a domain-specific explanation based on a very specific question or problem. And I see metaphysics not as really engaged in explanation, but rather descriptive generalization. So looking at what all the special sciences have found and the sorts of explanations that have very often proven instrumentally explanatory in the sense that, oh, this helps me make predictions and to control the main specific phenomenon that I'm interested in as a scientist. Metaphysics then tries to generalize across, what are the categories that would apply across all of these special sciences, not to seek explanation, but description that's general enough to be inclusive of what all the special sciences are doing. And so that helps us avoid any special science saying, oh, I found the one cause to rule them all, and now I can explain everything else. That's, you can be, that's a bad form of metaphysics. That's metaphysics as explanation, whereas I would say we want metaphysics to remain descriptive generalization, not explanatory, because when you, like you're pointing out, Lauren, an explanation very much depends on the question you're asking. there's no global explanation, or at least I think we should be very suspicious of the idea of a global explanation.
I think there's like a language point here about what we talk about when we talk about metaphysics as these, these overall really huge overarching general points and these huge questions that are sort of unanswerable, and then what we can formalize in a common language, right? So like the layer down from that. So the sort of world of these causally effective abstract objects or these attractors, and I think the interesting thing is that there are many different frameworks, formalisms, and theories in all the hard sciences, but generally they're all expressible in computational language. And so when you comport a map of those things with a common language, there's some non-trivial benefit, because typically the structure of science, at least in the 21st century, is a lot of people work on the edges of a discipline, pulling out the frontier of whatever their specific explanatory target is. But by joining the language up in a single map, there's a lot more low order, easy to exploit, effectively computational free lunches from copied equivalences across domains and across different formalisms that might get you deeper explanatory power within that graph or at the edges of the graph as well, because it unlocks something in some other part of it. And so here, what's interesting is that if you comport the language of metaphysical systems, not the overarching question, but the systems they describe, you can also map that not non-trivially, but in a coherent fashion with the computational expressions of all of those theories in a way that perhaps is connective, isn't an explanation, but is a structural architecture that can hold those things together so that they can be probed in a sort of joined up way, or a more joined up way than the 20 different mathematical languages we have for 10 lots of different things in physics to lots of different things in maths. And that's, I think, what part, when we talk about why is pure math really valuable, because ultimately they're determining the bounds of that structure, or the operators for that structure that are most universal or most useful to enable that detailed mapping from bottom back to sort of some universal expression of that language.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I would like to also ask you what you think of, let's call it like pre-linguistic, I would say, conceptions, because from as far as I understood it, one also has as basal cognition this mechanism of, you can say it's synesthetic, but some would argue that is this basal mechanism for perceiving, for example, patterns in space without direct observation, but perhaps there seems to be more to it, as the potential to find new ways to express this, because otherwise one can always fall into Gödel's prediction that whatever it is that we will even try to describe and not explain will have some sort of blind spot to something that may be rather relevant to our quest.
Yeah, I think that blind spot is just always there, because you're ultimately coarse graining, so you're going to get some very lossy representation of some sort of big meta object like that, or something that's sort of pre-linguistic. And when you think about pre-linguistic structures, we've talked about them in psychology, and like Jungian archetypes are like the typical example that people use. But they're meant to be big things. Like these are those archetypes are the things that you can be. You're a composition of these archetypes, and every decision you make is a composition of them. In this sort of language, they're highly causally effective. They're like a structure that is always present in the function you're running as an observer when you're figuring out how to use your internal model to do whatever you want to get to wherever you're pointing in that space. And so when you go down to the level of basal cognition, you think of things like, you think of very young babies and how they can make out shape only. what that, and you know, black and white. Why? Because that's simple. It's the basis distinction, the basis binary distinction that you can get to start building a world model with that's stable. And so that's how that complexity, I think, gets constructed. You have these sort of very, very hugely causal categories of things that you identify first that are pre-linguistic, and then they're sort of scaffolded with linguistic conceptions or more detailed or fine-grained conceptions of those objects as you create more equivalences and as you go through that process. So you handle it in this mapping as a domain, and it's a domain where, you know, the computational object has lots of coverage over the lower domains or the subcategories, right? So if you're carving up the domains, you do it by negation. You exclude certain informational objects that are more complex, i.e. don't meet a threshold, and then you work down to sort of the most fine-grained and most specified part of that structure, where the most rules or the most computational rules have to be on for anything to happen, which is the real world we live in today. And this sort of domain structuring, or this foliation of this computational structure, is one of the things that I think is starting to come out also in empirical results around things like IIT, and they did a decomposition of it into sort of 4 or 5, I think 4 layers. You're seeing it in tests of even how LLMs map spaces. Everything maps in layers, pulls together. You see it in brain regions, in tests around which parts do what and where they come together. And so this sort of dynamic feels like it's again working all the way up, where you're constructing very, very simple, very, very few rule objects first. And as we explore and exploit those objects to explore more of that space, we get to sort of the boundary where we live today in the present moment, where we're effectively doing that. We're either exploring or exploiting some object in our causal history that we've already got utility from to make use of it. So it's a computationist model, which can sound quite cold, but it does imply that those things actually exist and are real and they matter. As sort of a fallout of that idea, the fallout of that sort of hypothesis is that things like, you know, pure relation or pure difference is incorrect. That these things, that's actually a very good exploration policy. It's not a good exploitation policy at the limit. And again, when you're dealing with sort of accountably infinite space of possible computations or possible states, then that becomes quite important as time goes on. It might work well in finite time. And I think what we do as sort of systems or groups of observers or groups of people traversing these types of spaces is we bounce between exploration and exploitation as an optimal strategy to sort of colonize or search the spaces, or to sort of capture as much of that structure as we can. And so that gives you an informational mimetic angle to, you know, something physical in evolution. So you go from bound, you know, you don't just have for an observer persistence in time as a metric. You don't just have survival, you have boundedness, how much computation you can do. So those things balance out as exploration and exploitation in that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. You know, evolutionary biologist, I would think that's a great way of framing things. You know, when we say, you know, pure difference isn't enough, because you know, sort of cryptically referencing Deleuze there, and you had mentioned, you know, said a couple of things about post-structuralism earlier. I think it's again just important within that discourse, and even within the philosophy of the person that we're referencing there. You know, what is the operation that pure difference, that conception of pure difference, was looking to achieve. And certainly in that philosophy, which is a very evolutionary philosophy, there's no sense that the exploit aspect is neglected through a doctrine like stratification or whatever. I mean, we don't need to get into the details there, but again, there's a kind of priority that is a methodological priority that is being posited by a thinker like that, where they're saying, well, instead of erecting the strata or the forms, let's say, as something that is a priori and thus has a certain authority associated with it. Like it cannot really be deviated from because we're always going to be recaptured by it. The function there of the difference is to say, well, look, novel forms, novel strata can be generated in an open-ended way, and we will then exploit them. Like it's not the dichotomy there is not.
I think you're totally right. It's not, apologies for being a bit coarse.
Oh, good.
It's a question of time, and it's a question of finite and infinite time. So there's a theory of finite game theory and infinitary game theory. So if you have infinite time, that strategy is optimal. But if the structure is closed, again, it comes back to the structural component of the object. If the object's formalism and structure is proven wrong and it functions and you can generate physics from this object from an open category, then this is wrong. But if the structure is closed, it means at the infinite limit that strategy is suboptimal, because as you start to asymptotically approach that sort of end point of all these possible states, you can't, by going for difference, you're not mapping the simplest connections that will bring you closer to that state. So it's computationally inefficient as you approach a limit point only. So in finite time, it's absolutely fine. And because we're finite and get 80 or 90 years, it's probably the best strategy we've got. But at the infinite limit in this structure, it's an inefficient strategy because it will fail to achieve convergence in the fastest possible way. And therefore, if you're sort of thinking this idea is kind of a best of all possible worlds argument, where if you have some infinite space of informational object, because information can be expressed in form of energy, that imagines that space has infinite energy as well, if you abstract that to a physical explanation. And something with infinite energy has to go kind of as fast as it can. And that's sort of the sort of idea that you can take that jump from finite to infinite time. So would you think that strategy is optimal given that predicate? Probably not. But if you get rid of the predicate, you don't need it. So it's imported from that sort of axiom.
I think, and again, I'm really fascinated by what you're saying, Sam, but I think there's an inherent tension between you using game theory and talking about strategies, and what would be optimal to do, and then bringing in the infinite time scale as a way of adjudicating between strategies, because strategizers are not working at that time scale. And I sort of, well, I mean, there's a discussion to hear about conditions of closure, and then, of course, when you are, running things and developing your models using a closed system, essentially, that has been intentionally closed in its design, then there's a question to what extent are you just recovering your priors by recognizing, yes, the importance of closure if you want to achieve a specific goal actually in a finite time period. But
I think there's two points on the construction of the priors and the formalism that gets you to this closed object, right? It's built from bottom up, right? It's built from like a two-cell category that they import up. So it's a proven object that imports this structure. Now, it's not that it's the only formalism, but it's not an arbitrary take. It's this construction must work given these properties of these computational objects. I think the point on finite versus infinite time is right. Like in finite time, I'm saying yes, this is absolutely fair. You can pick whatever strategy you want because that's the ability to choose, and therefore that's a good in this sort of model. But what's mathematically imposed by the structure is mathematically imposed by the structure. So it's not a preference that is in at the limit. And again, there's a very huge difference between at the limit and what we can sample, right? So when the sort of the light cone that we get to sample from, we get to choose a broader range of strategies than is the optimal strategy for closing that space as a sort of evolutionary agent. That is sort of implied by the idea of sort of computational irreducibility. We can't compute, we don't know that that's the best way. or we don't know that that structure has to close because we can't get to that boundary. Therefore, that gives us the real choice at the sort of boundary in which strategy we choose to exploit that space or discover structure in it. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a function of the math, but not a function of the point where you're at now.
Yeah. I mean, I also just wonder, and I'm going to have to rush and eat because I'm having a blood sugar crash, but I haven't had brekkie yet. But I also just wonder if there's a constructivist argument that can be brought to bear, in a sense, constructivist mathematical argument against the function that the infinite limit is actually playing in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like literally, that's constructor theory is doing that. So constructor theory is still using an infinite base object, right? They're still using an infinite multiverse as a base object. I don't think they've specified like a geometry of that structure yet, or something that imports geometry. It's sort of a metaphysical assumption at the moment, but the common thread will be they're importing some structure, but they are building it bottom up in a much more, in a way that doesn't require that endpoint. So this is just one construction. The other construction is totally valid and being worked on by some, like, their work is unbelievable, and in fact those ideas are pretty critical in translating the sort of minimal observer model that the physics project team did into this category theoretic construction, because it's all about possible and impossible transformations. So you're absolutely right, it goes both ways for sure.
I'm really looking forward to reading your paper. Actually, I'm gonna look it up. The other thing I'd just say, just as a closing thing, is it would have been really interesting to have the conversation, because I think it's super relevant to so many of the things you brought up as well, Sam. But that Adam Saffron gestured to right at the beginning, which would have been a conversation about convergent evolution, and because you're relying on or continually deploying a notion of convergence. And it would be interesting to compare and contrast that, given the context of this discussion, Platonic space kind of in biology or stimulated by biology and reaching beyond, of the way convergence has in fact occurred many, many, many times. And, I always like to bring up the example of venom, and more than 100 times in actual biological evolution at finite timescales. And then so we start to look at what is the role of history, in fact, and at finite, definable, but vast timescales of stimulating those sorts of convergence events.
Yeah, so the paper, I did an extension or sort of an application of the paper to some of these ideas where convergent evolution is effectively, it's finding some optimal point, some valley or peak in a fitness landscape that's optimal for the entire landscape for that class, given their computation computational potential. And so those things become very important in sort of saying, does this sort of contention align with empirical results, right? And the contention here is that the hints are starting to be there, not just in historic work on convergent evolution, but more personally in Michael's work, where you're getting this idea of some structure of space, so some low, subcategorical object, some low down informational object that might be sampling from something bigger, from something bigger, from something bigger, from something bigger. And that might be eventually to the level of geometry in maths, or the actual shape of the object, the properties of that object. It might stop somewhere else. But what's interesting is we can, I think, now probe that space in different domains and different, just in words and in pictures, and see how that space maps. And the mapping may well be totally different to what everyone thinks, but the fact that that mapping is now coherently possible is, I think, one of the most exciting things that will happen in the next 10 years of science. I think more exciting than, whatever's going on in string theory, but not.
I'm sure I agree, actually. Yeah, fascinating stuff, Sam. Thanks, everyone. Really fascinating discussion, and hope to speak to many of you again. Yeah.